Lord Peter Wimsey, having lately developed a rather inconvenient fondness for turnip wine, a dubious passion cultivated during a recent weekend in Gloucestershire, had arrived at the modestly decaying estate of Crotchet's Gill with both an experimental crate and a cricket bat, neither of which he had the slightest intention of using as intended. He had accepted Lady Ufham's invitation, not out of any great enthusiasm for horticulture or her notorious attempts at matchmaking, both perennial features of her house parties, but because he had found in her letters a curious tone of fretful propriety, as though the geraniums in the conservatory had begun whispering moral accusations, and the parlour-maids had taken to fainting on alternate Tuesdays. "One should never underestimate the English shrubbery," Wimsey remarked to Bunter as they turned up the gravel drive. "It has seen more blood than a Balkan battlefield and more deceit than a bishop's memoir." Bunter, whose moral centre remained immovable regardless of topiary or treachery, inclined his head just perceptibly. "Indeed, my lord." Crotchet's Gill sprawled before them, an Edwardian monstrosity that had once aspired to Elizabethan charm, but ended somewhere in the vicinity of confused Gothic. The chimneys leaned like drunkards at evensong, and the ivy clung to the stone as if trying to strangle it. The gardener, they were told, had died that very morning. It was presented to them with the usual brisk village stoicism by a footman whose complexion suggested he was more familiar with sherry than sentiment. "Mr. Whodunit, my lord, fell into the well, head first like." Lady Upham, as decorative and angular as a stained-glass angel, greeted Wimsey on the front steps. Her smile was tightly tethered. "Peter, darling, you always arrive just when something dreadful has happened. I do hope you haven't brought that awful turnip business with you." "I have indeed," said Wimsey cheerfully, "and a bat in case I must defend it." Lady Upham did not laugh, but she did flutter, a mannerism Wimsey remembered from their Oxford days when she had been engaged to an Egyptologist who claimed to have been cursed by a cat-headed idol. He'd since retired to Bournemouth with a limp and an unusually strong aversion to cinnamon. Whodunit, she said, as they were ushered toward the conservatory, was a peculiar man, kept to himself, but never liked to see anyone walk across the south lawn after sunset, said it disturbed the roots of the roses or of his conscience. I don't think he made the distinction. Inside the house was all over polished mahogany and underpolished tempers. Wimsey noticed immediately that the fire was lit despite the August heat. The faint scent of peonies mingled unpleasantly with varnish and a recent suggestion of death. "I suppose," he murmured to Bunter, "one must take a gardener's fears with a pinch of sulphate. Still, head first into a well. That has the flavour of theatrical inevitability." The body, it seemed, had been discovered by the under-gardener, a stammering youth named Harold, who had promptly run to the house and fainted into the fishmonger's arms. "A classic reaction," noted Wimsey. "One must always faint near seafood in times of distress. Adds a certain biblical flair." The local constable, Constable Driggs, was already on the scene. He had a face like a weathered foot and a temperament. "Tomach. No sign of foul play, Lord Wimsey," he said as they peered into the mouth of the well, which gaped darkly like a judgmental aunt. "Slipped, poor man. Wasn't right in the head, mind you. Talked to the flowers. Said they talked back." "An unforgivable habit," said Wimsey, "especially if they start giving advice." Driggs huffed. "They say he was digging something, out back near the old hothouse. Didn't say what for." Wimsey's gaze shifted across the garden. The hothouse was a grim silhouette against the hedges, its glass cracked like a spider's web, its frame bowed. He felt inexplicably the same cold tickle one feels upon finding a forgotten letter in a dead man's coat. "How curious," he said. "I think, Bunter, we shall begin with the roses, and then perhaps descend into madness via marigolds. Lady Upham called them in for tea before they could explore further, but the hook had caught. It was not so much that a gardener had died in his own well, that sort of thing happened every other year in Gloucestershire, but that he had left behind, so Wimsey would soon learn, an oddly phrased diary entry, a patch of disturbed earth beneath a pear tree, and a pressed violet tucked into a page of the Anatomy of Melancholy, which, as Lord Peter Wimsey would later quip to the vicar, is hardly standard horticultural literature, unless, of course, you're planting despair. Lord Peter Wimsey lingered only briefly over his tea, poking half-heartedly at a scone that had clearly been baked with more moral conviction than flour. He was listening, more than half listening actually, to the buzz of conversation between Lady Upham and the other guests, as one listens to a half-tuned wireless waiting for the signal to resolve itself. A dreadful business, Mrs. Halifax was murmuring. A widow of the sort who dressed in mauve and tragedy. Though, I suppose, one always expected poor Thoday to come to a rather peculiar end. My geraniums refused to bloom for him. They bloom for Jenkins without so much as a fuss, but for Thoday they drooped. Even he said they didn't care for his presence. Plants are very intuitive, said Lady Upham, who had once written an article for the Country Gentleman about cucumbers and clairvoyance. You can't expect them to thrive under certain vibrations. Whimsy made a small noise, something between a cough and a snort, and excused himself on the pretext of stretching his legs. Vernter, ever discreet, followed behind like a well-creased shadow. The garden looked perfectly ordinary now, if one discounted the constable still poking about with a stick near the well and a trio of blackbirds engaged in a squabble over a squashed currant bun. Whimsy glanced at the crumbling hothouse where time and weather had collaborated to produce an effect not unlike a neglected mausoleum. It loomed quietly, as though trying not to be noticed, which of course made it irresistible. Bunter, Whimsy murmured, would you be so good as to occupy Driggs with some comment on the theoretical slipperiness of Gloucestershire limestone? I rather think he might respond to being educated on the matter. Bunter bowed faintly and approached the constable with the smooth inevitability of sunrise. Once alone, Whimsy strolled toward the hothouse. The lock on the door had been broken long ago, possibly by enthusiasm, more likely by weather, and swung, open with a groan of theatrical reluctance. The air inside was warm and musty, thick with the scent of rotting compost and faintly metallic soil. Empty pots were stacked haphazardly, and a cracked watering can lay like a discarded helmet atop a bed of brittle leaves. It was in the far corner, near a patch of dry, upturned earth, that Whimsy paused. Someone had dug here recently, not deeply, and not with any great skill. Whimsy noted the uneven edges of the hole, the scattering of soil that suggested haste. Whatever had been buried had either been removed or was never there. He crouched, ran a gloved hand lightly through the topsoil, and came away with something odd, a sliver of glass, not from the hothouse but smooth-edged, as though from a lens or bottle. He pocketed it without comment. A rustle behind him made him turn. It was Harold, the under-gardener, still pale and as angular as a wireframe model of fear. The boy looked as though he might bolt again, so Whimsy adopted the tone of an uncle, addressing a skittish schoolboy about overdue Latin homework. You found Thoday, didn't you? Harold nodded. Yes, sir. Went to check the water level. He always said we should in summer, and I saw his boots, sir, sticking out like roots. Did you touch the body? No, sir, I ran. I shouldn't have, I know, but he looked wrong. Wrong how? Harold struggled with the words. He looked as if he'd fallen asleep, but with his eyes open, not surprised, just watching. Whimsy studied the boy. Was Mr. Thoday afraid of anything? There was a pause. Didn't like the dark. Sir, not when he was outside. Said it pressed in, made the ground whisper. But he wasn't mad, sir, not really, just strange. Strangeness is vastly underrated, said Whimsy gently. Did he quarrel with anyone? Recently. The boy hesitated again. Miss Clytemnestra, he said at last. Miss, good heavens, that's a name. She's Lady Upham's niece, came last month, always out in the garden talking to him. Not proper talk, arguing, but quiet-like. I don't think she thought anyone noticed. Miss Clytemnestra, repeated Whimsy. And did the lady say what the arguments were about? No, sir, but once I heard her say, You promised me and now you're burying it. I won't let you. Whimsy's eyebrows rose. That's delightfully vague. Did he respond? Just. I said, some things rot faster than others. How poetic. Harold didn't smile. Thank you, Harold. You've been very helpful. Perhaps keep that information to yourself for the moment. The boy nodded and scurried off, clearly relieved to be dismissed. Whimsy stood alone again in the decaying hothouse, considering the sliver of glass in his pocket and the disturbed earth at his feet. A promise, something buried. a rotting secret. And the gardener, dead, watching, perhaps listening even now with botanical patience. Back in the house, the drawing-room had acquired a mild air of strained civility. Miss Clytemnestra Upham was playing a Chopin prelude on the piano with rather too much enthusiasm for grief. Whimsy approached the instrument as though it were ticking. "A charming interpretation," he said lightly, "though I believe you've—" turned the largo into a brisk foxtrot. Miss Upham smiled without warmth. She was perhaps 27, angular in feature but elegant in a classical sense, more Grecianerne than English rose. "I don't play for emotion," she replied, "only expression." Ah, the subtle difference. Rather like one between a death and decay, both final, but one more fragrant. She stopped playing. "Are you implying something, Lord Whimsy?" "Merely that Mr. Thoday seemed to have many expressions. Did you happen to observe any of them recently?" Her hands folded in her lap. "We talked. He was upset. I didn't press him. The poor man was always unusual. He promised you something, I hear." "Gossip," she said with sudden sharpness. "He was digging up an old flower bed, nothing more. And what did you expect him to find there?" She rose. "You'll have to excuse me. I'm not accustomed to being cross-examined over garden work." Whimsy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. But if ever you find yourself haunted by a rose bush, do let me know." She left, and the piano bench gave a sigh of relief. Whimsy turned to Bunter, who had materialized once again at his elbow. "She knows something," he murmured. "And she's not nearly as good a liar as she thinks. Let's have another look at that flower bed and see if any other promises were buried with poor Thoday." He reached into his waistcoat, withdrew the glass fragment, and held it up to the light. "Tell me, Bunter, does this strike you as optical or medicinal?" Bunter examined it with quiet interest. "A lens, my lord, possibly from a monocle or a camera." Whimsy nodded slowly. "Then we must ask ourselves, what did Mr. Thoday see before he fell?" And with that, he stepped back into the garden, where the roots whispered and the past, like a well, yawned, open beneath them. Whimsy made his second examination of the garden with a distinctly more attentive eye. His earlier ramble had been the leisurely saunter of a gentleman amateur. Now it was the circumspect survey of a man teasing out the syntax of an unspoken sentence. The south lawn, shaded and unusually spongy underfoot, drew his notice. He stooped near the shrubbery where the morning dew had not yet fully dried, and brushed his fingers along a stretch of flattened grass, no more than a yard or so in length, parallel to the hedge. Someone had lain there recently, or perhaps watched. From concealment, the grass still bore the shape of a body at rest or in wait. "Bunter," he murmured, straightening, "what do you make of this unseasonable nap?" Bunter joined him, crouching like a dignified butler examining a wine stain. "Recent, my lord. The grass has not recovered its vertical persuasion. I would say someone was here no earlier than last evening." "And if one wished to observe the well without being seen?" "This would be a sensible vantage point," Bunter said. "Concealed, and it overlooks both the hothouse path and the well's rim." Whimsy glanced back at the house, its windows blinking with polished propriety. "It's never the obvious line of sight that yields truth. It's always the line someone thought they'd hidden." They returned to the hothouse, where Whimsy once again examined the broken ground. This time he noted something new, a fragment of a torn page, damp and pressed into the corner of the frame. He teased it out gently. It was part of a letter, handwritten, but only a few words remained legible. "And if you dare bring it up again, I swear, bury the past or be buried by it." The script was feminine, elegant, and unhesitating. He tucked it away with care. Back in the house, he asked for access to Mr. Thoday's personal effects. The late gardener, it seemed, had kept a small room above the stables, a Spartan affair with a narrow bed, a stack of weathered botany journals, and a single drawer locked with a brass mechanism that bore more pride than practicality. It opened easily with a twist of Whimsy's penknife. Inside, alongside a roll of pressed plant specimens and a pair of battered spectacles, lay a small notebook. The entries were not dated, nor entirely coherent. Thoday's handwriting was a crabbed affair winding down the page in jagged lines as though resisting transcription. Whimsy skimmed, the hothouse nose, The fig tree, too. Old things in soil speak louder the longer they've been ignored. C said it was necessary. Promises rot, but memory roots. And further down, in different ink, hastier. She watches at night. Thinks I don't see. I see everything now. Whimsy shut the book gently, his expression one of calm intrigue. He turned to Bunter, who was inspecting the corners of the small room with the thoroughness of a man checking for structural treachery. Did you note, Bunter, that he never named her? Discretion or fear, my lord? Ah, but therein lies the paradox. He names her in silence. He returned to the drawing-room where the guests had reconvened. It was late afternoon now, and the light had acquired the lazy gold of resigned summer. Lady Upham was trying to interest a Colonel Fortescue in her theories about hedgehogs and ley lines. Miss Clytemnestra sat by the window, ostensibly reading, though her eyes had not moved in 10 minutes. Whimsy approached her with the casual air of a man requesting a recipe. You knew Thode well. She looked up slowly. I tended the roses. He assisted. He wrote about you. Her mouth twitched. I imagine he wrote many things. None of them printable. Rather the contrary. His last entries were profoundly poetic. Soil, memory, promises, burials. She shut the book she hadn't been reading. If you're accusing me of something, oh heavens, no, I merely observe. I am, tragically addicted to observation. It often spoils my enjoyment of parties. What is it you think I buried? She asked coldly. Hope, perhaps, a promise unkept. Something that blooms despite being unloved. You're very fond of metaphor, Lord Whimsy. Yes, and simile too, though it's often underappreciated. Shall we walk? He led her out onto the terrace, where the sun drew long shadows across the flagstones. She walked beside him, stiff-backed, defiant. I think, Whimsy said, that Mr. Thode saw something he was not meant to see. Not last week or last month, but long ago. Something he tried to forget. You imagine a great deal. Oh, always, but only enough to make the facts entertaining. The letter fragment, for instance. A lady's hand full of threat and regret. I found it near the earth. He disturbed. I dare say he kept it, couldn't quite bear to destroy it. Clytemnestra's jaw clenched. He threatened me. Whimsy inclined his head. I thought as much. What did he want? He said he would tell my uncle, Lady Upham's husband, about what we'd done, what we buried. And what was that? There. Was a long silence. Then, quietly, she said, My child. Whimsy stood very still. I was 18, he was older, too old. He said he loved me, then said it had to disappear. We buried the truth, beneath a pear tree, of all places. I made him promise never to speak of it, and he didn't, for years. He began changing, rambling, writing, digging. I was afraid he would unearth more than soil, Whimsy said gently. You argued. Yes. And then he died, conveniently. I didn't kill him. Whimsy looked at her for a long moment. I don't think you did. She stared at him, stunned. If you had, he continued, you wouldn't have spoken so plainly. Besides, there's something missing. A witness. A shadow. He turned his gaze back toward the garden. The person who lay in the grass. The person who watched. She followed his gaze. Someone else knew? Whimsy's smile was thin. Someone always does. Behind them, from the drawing-room, came the sound of Lady Upham's laughter. Bright, brittle, and terribly out of place. Whimsy made a mental note to examine the pear tree next, for in gardens, secrets don't merely grow, they cling, spore-like, to the hands that plant them. Whimsy waited until dusk softened the edges of the house before he made his way alone to the old pear tree. The garden, mostly tamed but not wholly obedient, had taken on an air of conspiratorial silence. The leaves overhead rustled with deliberate discretion, and the earth beneath his shoes seemed to remember footsteps with more clarity than it should. He paused beside the tree, an ancient thing, crooked and proud, with roots like arthritic fingers, breaking the surface of the soil. The grass here, unlike elsewhere, grew in irregular tufts, disrupted in patches. Someone had recently knelt. Whimsy could almost see the ghost of them, legs tucked under, one hand braced for balance, the other digging slowly, reverently, perhaps regretfully. He knelt. Not to dig at once, but to listen. The air was still. No birds now, even the wind had ceased its gentle heckling of the shrubs, and then he began. Not with a spade, he had none, but with his hands, bare and methodical. Inch by inch he lifted, the earth working by the failing light. The soil here had been disturbed within the last week, maybe less. He knew the difference. Gardening was only another kind of sleuthing after all. You learn to detect the tampered root, the unnatural angle, the lie told by a weed. 2 inches down, his fingers touched something that resisted. Not metal, not stone, soft but solid. He scraped further, brushing the earth aside. A linen-wrapped parcel, about the size of a large book, tied with twine discolored by damp. He hesitated just for a moment, then unwrapped it. Inside he found a child's blanket, faded pink patterned with yellow rabbits, and within that a bundle of photographs, and letters carefully folded but warped with age. A rattle, wooden and worn smooth, nestled among them like a relic. Whimsy sat back on his heels. This was no mere love affair. This was history, hushed and entombed. A confession wrapped in flannel and silence. He picked through the letters. Most were unsigned, simple notes, fragments of planning, snatches of longing or despair. One, written on thin blue paper, read, "I cannot keep it. My uncle suspects already. He says I am unwell. He will have me sent away. He will never let me stay. If he knows, bury it, please, if you love me." Another, in a different hand, sharper, older, male, simply said, "She is not the first in this family to break the rules. She will be corrected." He folded them back into the blanket and stood, brushing himself off. Bunter was waiting at the edge of the path when Whimsy emerged from the shadow of the tree, my lord. "We've found our motive," Whimsy said softly, "but not yet our murderer." He did not speak again until they were inside and in the sanctum of his borrowed study, a room formerly used for drying herbs, now pressed into service for the art of deduction. He spread the contents of the parcel on the desk with gentle precision. "Bunter, I have a feeling that whatever happened between Thode and Miss Clytemnestra is only the surface. There is another hand in this, someone older, someone who knew and wanted it to stay buried." Bunter nodded. "The tone of the second letter suggests authority, possibly Lord Upham himself, or perhaps someone speaking for him, a housekeeper, a relative, someone who handled the mess and never forgot it." Whimsy leaned back. "And someone who, when Thode began to stir the dust, decided it was safer to silence him permanently." There was a soft knock at the door. It was Lady Upham. Her figure was backlit, giving her the appearance of a ghost wrapped in silk and indignation. "I hope I'm not intruding, Peter." "Not at all," he said, "merely reviewing some archived correspondence." Her eyes flicked to the spread. She did not flinch. "I presume you've been rooting about in the pear tree. One must occasionally return to Eden to understand the fall." She entered, closing the door with unnecessary gentleness. "I had hoped this would remain quiet." "So, did Mr. Thode, I imagine." Her mask shifted, just slightly. "He was a kind man, but not a wise one. And yet he kept your niece's secret for years." Lady Upham took a seat, her back straight, hands folded. "He loved her. In his own strange, thorny way. It was never a romance, you understand. But she meant something to him. He meant to tell someone, or perhaps to finally acknowledge. The child." She looked away. "There was no child." Whimsy merely raised an eyebrow. "A birth," she admitted. "But it was... still. We never spoke of it again." He said nothing. "She was so young, Peter. I did what I thought was best. For her, for the family. And for the child, if you must know. Some things, some beginnings do more harm than good, if allowed to bloom." Whimsy's gaze did not waver. "Who else knew?" Lady Upham hesitated. "My late husband, briefly, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Belden. She handled everything." "Handled?" Lady Upham's eyes hardened. "She was efficient, unsentimental, and utterly loyal." Whimsy stood. "Then I should like to speak to her, immediately." But it was not necessary, for at that moment Bunter re-entered, silent and pale. "My lord, Mrs. Belden is missing." "Missing?" Whimsy's voice was sharp. "She was last seen before luncheon. Her room has been packed. Her suitcase is gone. No note. No destination." Whimsy turned back to Lady Upham, whose composure fractured for the first time. "She wouldn't," she whispered. "Oh, I rather think she would," said Whimsy. "If she believed the roots were being disturbed again, if she feared that old secrets would resurface, if she thought her loyalty meant action." Lady Upham shook her head. She was firm, but she wouldn't— "She wouldn't what, dear lady?" "Kill a man, or kill a memory." Lady Upham stood slowly. "I don't know." Whimsy turned to Bunter. "We need a list of all transport from the village this afternoon. Trains, buses, motor cars, anything. And check the station master. If she's gone to London, she won't stay long. Guilt never does." Then, softly, almost to himself, "The question is not who died, but who decided the truth must not live." The house outside the room creaked as though in agreement. The night closed in, and the gardener's last harvest was beginning to yield its bitter fruit. Whimsy slept little that night, though he stretched out on the guest bed with every pretense of rest. The house had taken on a peculiar hush, more than mere nocturnal quiet. It was the kind of strained silence that follows a whispered argument in a church pew. Somewhere beneath the old timbers and layers of respectability, something had shifted. The air felt taut with withheld breath. At first light he rose dressed without sound, and descended the servants' stairs with the familiarity of a man used to not being where he ought to be. The kitchen was empty, still warm from the fire banked. Overnight, he brewed himself a cup of strong tea, uninvited but unashamed, and was finishing it when Bunter entered with that uncanny knack for arriving exactly at the moment one's cup is drained. "She took the 4:17 train, my lord," Bunter reported softly, handing over a slip of paper. "Single fare to Paddington, confirmed by the station master. A porter remembered her distinctly, carried her trunk himself, said she tipped with the efficiency of a woman who knew the exact value of coin." "Paddington," murmured Whimsy, scanning the note. "So she's either fleeing or circling." Bunter inclined his head. "The ticket was purchased under her name, no alias, which suggests she doesn't intend to vanish, just to move a few pieces out of harm's way." Whimsy returned to the study. The bundle from beneath the pear tree lay precisely where he'd left it, untouched, guarded by the heavy silence of consequence. He untied it again, laid out the letters, and turned once more to the child's blanket, running his fingers along its hem. This time something caught, almost imperceptibly, a seam that had been re-sewn by an unpracticed hand. He reached for his penknife. Inside, barely more than a whisper beneath the fabric, was a locket, silver, small, engraved with the letter E. He opened it. Inside was a curl of hair, brown, not blonde, and a photograph so faded it was nearly ghosted away. But not entirely. The woman's face was unmistakable. Lady Upham, and the man beside her was not her husband. Whimsy sat back, the locket resting in his palm, so the story deepened, and with it the roots. The girl had not simply been seduced by a fleeting fancy or betrayed by an ill-chosen lover. She had been protected, actively, calculatingly, by someone with power and motive, and Thode had been the one made to shoulder the aftermath. Not just as accomplice, but as confessor, custodian, and eventual threat. Whimsy was about to rise when a soft knock came at the door. It opened before he could answer. It was Clytemnestra. She looked pale, her usually flawless composure slightly askew, as if sleep had passed her by without regret. "I need to speak to you," she said without preamble. He gestured for her to enter. She did so, but stood arms crossed near the fireplace. "I know Mrs. Belden is gone. I admire your efficiency of information." Harold heard the maids talking. "Nothing stays quiet in this house. Not really. It just pretends." Whimsy said nothing. Clytemnestra stared at the floor. She was the one who arranged it all, the birth, the burial, everything, and what did she expect in return? Silence, compliance, I don't know. She served my aunt, but there was always a strange authority in her. She never raised her voice, but she could dismiss you with a look. Did she threaten you? Not in words, she didn't have to. Whimsy approached the desk, picked up the locket, and held it out to her. She stared at it for a long time before taking it. She kept this? No. He did. Thode. Hidden. All these years. Clytemnestra looked up, eyes wide. Then he remembered. He never forgot. She sank into a chair. I didn't know he had this. I thought he buried the truth with the rest. I thought it was over. No truth ever stays buried, said Whimsy. It merely waits. A silence settled. Then, she didn't kill him, Clytemnestra said quietly. She scared him, intimidated him, certainly. But Mrs. Belden wasn't strong. She never lifted things herself. She had people. Whimsy tilted his head. People? There were always workmen. Men from the village, quiet, obedient. I always thought she knew something about them, had something on them. If she wanted someone gone, Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Do you remember any names? Just one. George Skeggs, a handyman. Did odd repairs. He stopped coming around about a month ago. Do you know where he lives? No, but he used to meet someone in the orchard sometimes. I saw them once. Talking low. Whimsy stood. Then I shall speak to our good constable. Driggs, gruff and sceptical as ever, was not thrilled to be fetched from his breakfast, but the name George Skeggs turned his scowl inward. Skeggs? Suspicious fellow, that one. Lived near the mill, kept to himself. Bit too fond of the bottle, if you ask me. I never ask, said Whimsy, smiling. But I do listen. Could we visit him? They found Skeggs in his shed behind the mill, half drunk and wholly startled by their arrival. He tried to bluff, then bluster, then deny. It was only when Driggs produced a warrant that his resolve cracked like a dropped plate. I didn't mean to kill him, Skeggs muttered, hunched over a sagging table. Just meant to give him a scare. Old woman said he was stirring up ghosts, said he was going to shame the family, said it had all come undone. She paid me to frighten him off. And instead, you pushed him, Whimsy said softly. Skeggs looked up, eyes bleary. I didn't push, he backed away, said I was mad, slipped, that's all. One moment he was yelling, next he was gone. Into the well. I looked down, called his name, but he didn't answer. So I ran. Whimsy's face remained calm. And the locket? Skeggs blinked. What locket? You didn't take it from him? No, never touched nothing. Back at the house, Whimsy returned once more to the study where the locket remained on the desk, quiet and damning. He turned to Bunter. She never expected him to keep it. She thought everything had been buried, both literally and legally. But Thode had a conscience, or a memory too strong for silence. And now, my lord? Now we gather them, Whimsy said. Lady Upham, Miss Clytemnestra, and our housekeeper, should she return. The play is nearly ended, and it's time for the curtain to rise on Act 3. He looked once more at the locket. It always comes back to the child. The library at Crotchet's Gill had not been used for anything approaching reading since the Boer War. It was a long, narrow chamber lined with books whose spines were more ornamental than informative. Volumes of unread Byron, a complete but untouched Thackeray, and several suspiciously uniform tomes labelled British Birds that, upon closer inspection, were stuffed with blank pages. Lord Peter Whimsy chose it precisely for its theatrical possibilities. The room gave the impression of weight and solemnity, which he found helpful when truth was about to make its entrance. He stood by the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, the locket open on the table beside him. The light was low, the curtains drawn. Bunter, silent and watchful, stood just behind the second wing-back chair. A small tray of tea sat untouched. Whimsy found people told the truth better. Without biscuits, Lady Upham entered first, her expression brittle and armoured. Clytemnestra followed, still pale, but with a strange clarity in her gaze now, like someone who had ceased hoping to win, and now merely hoped to be understood. Whimsy inclined his head. "I've asked you here," he began gently, "because the gardener is dead, and the child is not." Lady Upham stiffened, but said nothing. Clytemnestra blinked. "What do you mean?" "The locket," said Whimsy, nodding toward it, "contained, along with your photograph, Lady Upham, and a piece of hair belonging not to a stillborn infant, but to a living one. The hair is too well preserved. I consulted an expert. Also, there are no signs of burial decay in the blanket. It wasn't in the ground long, just enough to feign secrecy. Lady Ufham's hands curled in her lap. You lied, Whimsy said calmly. To your niece, to Thode, to yourself perhaps. The child did not die. The child was sent away. The silence was total. Even the wall seemed to lean forward. Clytemnestra's voice was barely audible. Alive? More than that. Raised by a couple in the village, quietly supported, indirectly connected. Mrs. Belden arranged it all. I found the payment stubs in her desk this morning, regular transfers to a family named Wedge. The mother died 5 years ago. The father, well, a war casualty, but the boy lives still. His name is Edward. Clytemnestra's mouth parted. That name? Indeed, Whimsy murmured. E for Edward. The engraving on the locket. Your son. Lady Upham closed her eyes. I had to, she said finally, voice brittle. What was I to do? My husband was a proud, repressed man. He'd have disowned her. It would have ruined everything. So I told her the child died. I told her it was for the best. She was barely more than a child herself. And Thode? Whimsy asked. He knew. He helped. He dug the grave, so to speak, and buried the truth with it. But he couldn't forget. He watched her, watched me, every day. He never said a word. But I knew. That silence was a weight I carried. Whimsy nodded slowly. Until he began to dig again. Not just the earth, but the past. Perhaps he meant to tell Edward himself. Perhaps he wanted to confess. Mrs. Belden saw the danger. Lady Upham shook her head slowly. She would have stopped him. She did. Through Skeggs. Clytemnestra looked at Whimsy sharply. You're saying she ordered him to scare him, yes, not to kill. But things done in fear have a way of spilling over. Skeggs panicked. The well did the rest. And Edward, whispered Clytemnestra. Does he know? No. Not yet. She turned toward her aunt, and for the first time since the investigation began, her voice lost its cultivated distance. You told me I was mad, that I'd imagined it, that I'd lost the child. You lied. Lady Upham stood up sharply. I protected you. No. You protected yourself, your name, your standing, your place on the parish board. Whimsy stepped in before it could tip into accusation. And yet perhaps both are true. Protection often masquerades as manipulation, but truth once buried does not decay. It ripens. Clytemnestra turned back to him. Where is he? In the village. He works with the Wedge's cousin, at the grocer's. He reads poetry. He's very fond of dogs. Tears came then, sudden and without ceremony. Clytemnestra did not sob. She merely pressed one hand to her mouth and turned away, her shoulders trembling. Whimsy gave her a moment. Then, more softly, he said, You may tell him or not, that is your decision. But the law will have its due. Skeggs has confessed. Mrs. Belden, if she returns, will face consequences. And you... He turned to Lady Upham. Must live with the lie you planted and the roots it spread. Lady Upham did not reply. She sank slowly back into the chair, as though her structure had collapsed from within. Later, Whimsy stood alone on the terrace, watching the garden shift beneath the weight of the wind. Bunter joined him, silent as dusk. She took it hard. My lord. As one does when one's fictions are dug up like bulbs in spring. The boy? He'll be told, but gently, not by me. Do you think he'll want to know her? I think he already does, Whimsy murmured. Even if he doesn't know why, blood calls in strange ways. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. There's a peculiar justice in gardening, Bunter. We reap only what we sow, and sometimes what others sow in our name. Yes, my lord. Whimsy took one last look at the well, now boarded, silent again. Funny thing, he said. People always fear ghosts, but it's memories that haunt us worst. And then he turned inside, where the truth, like the roses, would need time and light to bloom. Whimsy did not leave Crotchet's Gill the next morning, though the matter might on paper have seemed resolved. Skeggs was in custody, the full chain of events laid out with tragic precision. A hired intimidation gone wrong, a death unintended but no less final, a conspiracy of silence that spanned decades and curled back into the garden like an ingrown root, and yet something remained, not out of place precisely but unresolved, like the last note of a fugue that lingers a fraction too long. He wandered through the garden in the early light, the dew dampening his cuffs. Bunter followed at a discreet distance. They passed the well, now covered by a fresh plank and marked with a crude rope barrier, a gesture both theatrical and insufficient. The pear tree stood quietly beside it, unjudging and unchanged. Whimsy stopped, hands in his coat pockets, and looked again at the hothouse. "I've never trusted buildings that decay too symmetrically," he murmured, Bunter unblinking. "The symmetry may be the only honest part, my lord." They stepped inside. The heat of the morning was just beginning to creep in through the glass, and the earthy scent of old compost clung to the air like history. Whimsy examined the floor again, particularly the disturbed section he had noted days ago, now recovered, but only just. Someone had attempted to tidy it as though in hope the earth might forget. "I never asked why he was digging in here," Whimsy said. "Not exactly. He had no reason to bury the locket here. He kept it with him, and the letters were beneath the tree. So this was something else? Or someone else's secret entirely?" Whimsy crouched and brushed his fingers across the topsoil. His hand came away not dusty but oily. A faint residue. He dipped his handkerchief, sniffed. "Turpentine," he said, frowning. "Why turpentine in a hothouse?" Bunter said nothing but moved to the wooden crate tucked near the back wall. Inside, hidden beneath a pile of cracked pots, was a tin canister. Its label was faded but legible. Turpentine, yes, and next to it, a book, a gardening ledger or so it appeared. But inside were no lists of seed types or bloom dates. It was a ledger of correspondences. Letters received, noted in neat, clinical script, names and addresses, payments. He passed it to Whimsy. "She kept records," Whimsy said softly. "She always kept records." "Mrs. Belden?" Whimsy nodded. "She arranged everything, including, I dare say, a few other silences. These names, many are local, a midwife, a doctor who left the village suddenly, one or two housemaids who simply disappeared from the staff rolls." He flipped further. Toward the back, the script. Changed. Rougher. A different hand and different content. A letter. Unsent. Undated. "She thinks I'll stay silent forever. That I am just the gardener, and that time makes roots of guilt. But I know what was done, not just to her, to the others. I can't forget the night I saw her in the hothouse. Not Lady Upham. Her, the other one, the one who screamed and then was gone." Whimsy stood, eyes narrowing. "There was another child," Bunter asked. "Another woman." He looked again at the floor, then to the wall, a panel slightly askew. He stepped over, pressed it. It groaned and gave way. Behind it, a hollow, just large enough to hide a box. Wooden, locked. He pried it open. Inside, beneath more letters and a folded chemise yellowed with age, lay a birth certificate. No name for the mother. Father, listed as unknown. Date, 20 years ago. Bunter glanced at it. "Before Miss Clytemnestra," Whimsy's voice was low. "Before Lady Upham took over the house, before she married, before all this was meant to be respectable. There was a photo, too. A young maid, frightened but defiant, holding a baby. The Backreed Marion 1906, not forgotten." Whimsy exhaled slowly. "This house has roots in every corner, and it's no longer just about Clytemnestra's child. Thoday knew about this. He found the box, and Mrs. Belden, she knew he had it, and tried to recover it," Bunter said. "Possibly after his death," Whimsy mused. "She came back to the hothouse. She cleaned up, resealed the wall, but she missed the turpentine." He stared out the broken window where the garden swayed gently in the breeze. She wasn't just protecting Lady Upham. She was cleaning a system, a network of secrets. Abandoned children, silenced servants, things this house bred like mold in a damp drawer. Bunter was quiet. "What now, my lord?" "We show the records to Driggs. We track these names. We speak to anyone still living." We find Marian if she's still alive, or the child. And Edward? He must know he's not alone in this, that he's not the only one born of silence. Whimsy closed the box, his expression unreadable. There's a cruelty in forgetting, he said. But there's a deeper cruelty in forcing others to forget. They returned to the house, the ledger in tow. Driggs was less surprised than he should have been. Perhaps some part of the local police had long known there were corners of Crotchet's Gill one did not question too closely. When they confronted Lady Upham again, her silence was not of denial, but fatigue. I didn't know about Marian, she said simply, but I knew the house had a way of smoothing things over. My husband was efficient. Your housekeeper more so, said Whimsy. She closed her eyes. I thought protecting my niece was my greatest guilt. I was wrong. You were merely the last chapter, Whimsy said. But the story began long before. Clytemnestra came in moments later, Edward behind her. He looked between them, uncertain. Whimsy stepped aside, and for the first time, no one spoke. The garden outside swayed gently. The past, like a buried root disturbed at last, began to lift toward the air. The air in the drawing room that evening bore a strange weight, not of grief exactly, but of consequence, like the last moment of a symphony where the audience does not yet know whether to applaud. Edward sat stiffly on the edge of the faded chintz sofa, his teacup untouched in his hands. Clytemnestra had taken a seat across from him, though her posture betrayed the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Lady Upham, pale and unspeaking, had retreated to the writing desk where she seemed absorbed in rearranging the same stack of letters over and over again. Whimsy stood by the window, his silhouette framed in the soft gold of the setting sun. He was not watching them, not directly but rather listening, waiting as though he could hear the story unfold through their breathing. I don't know what to say, Edward said at last, his voice remarkably steady. You needn't say anything yet, Clytemnestra replied quietly. Only listen if you want to. He nodded once, slowly. There are things I didn't know, things I'm still only beginning to understand, she went on. What happened to you? To us? It wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision. Others made it for me. I thought, you were lost. I didn't know I was ever found, he said almost wryly, and Whimsy turned just slightly, noting the flicker of irony beneath the boy's composure. A survivor's wit, born not of cynicism, but of necessity. Lady Upham glanced up, and for a moment it seemed she might speak, but the moment passed and she turned back to her letters. Whimsy cleared his throat softly. Forgive the interruption, but there is one last matter I feel compelled to address, before this house settles back into the soil. Edward looked up. In the course of my rummaging through the inconvenient past, Whimsy said, I discovered not one buried truth but two. The second, I suspect, may concern you more than anyone. He retrieved the box from the desk, restored now to its locked state but no longer hidden, and laid it on the table before Edward. This, he said, was hidden in the hothouse, behind a panel no one had touched in years. It belonged, I believe, to a girl named Marian, a maid in this household 20 years ago. Clytemnestra looked sharply at Whimsy. Another child? Possibly. The documents are vague, but they suggest a birth. A quiet one, an unwanted one, much like your own, Edward. He opened the box. Edward leaned forward, hesitantly lifting the photo. I've seen her, he said slowly. In the grocer's back room. Mr. Wedge kept it in a drawer. He said she was someone who helped my mother, but he never explained. She was likely your nurse, if not more, Whimsy said. The Wedges took you in on Mrs. Belden's arrangement. But Marian, she was something else, someone who saw things. She tried to speak out. And I believe Mrs. Belden silenced her, just as she tried to silence Thoday. Only Marian disappeared more completely. Dead? Edward asked, eyes hardening. We don't know. But I've asked Driggs to look into unmarked graves and old death notices in the county archives. The paper trail is faint, but it smells, how shall I put it, of disinfectant and denial. Lady Upham rose then abruptly. I had nothing to do with that. No, said Whimsy, not unkindly. You were likely still abroad at the time. This particular sin predates you." She gripped the edge of the desk. "But it happened in this house, and that," Whimsy replied gently, "is enough to haunt it." Edward's gaze did not shift from the photograph. "So, I'm not the only secret." "No," said Clytemnestra. "You were never alone. They made me believe that, but it wasn't true." He looked at her, really looked for the first time, and the weight of recognition passed between them. Not familiarity, but alignment. The same gravity had pulled them through different orbits, and now, perhaps, they were finding a shared center. Whimsy allowed the silence to settle, and then he moved toward the door. "I think," he said, "we've dug enough for 1 week." Bunter, waiting in the corridor with his usual prescience, handed him his coat. "Driggs will send word if Mrs. Belden turns up," he said quietly, "and I've arranged for a genealogist to examine the household records from 1906 onward." "Excellent," Whimsy said. "I do so enjoy history when it's freshly exhumed. Will you be returning to London, my lord?" "In the morning. I've had my fill of roses and revelations." "And I suspect Miss Clytemnestra and young Edward have things to discuss, without a detective lurking behind every curtain." As he descended the staircase one last time, Whimsy paused to take in the hall. The portraits seemed less stern now. Still, watching but no longer forbidding. The house, once swollen with unsaid things, had begun to breathe again. Outside, the garden lay quiet in the dusk. At the edge of the pear tree's shadow, Whimsy stopped and knelt, brushing a hand through the ye. "Grass they never plant truth intentionally," he murmured, "but it finds the light all the same." And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy rose, tipped his hat to the ghosts, and walked toward the gate. Whimsy had intended to leave Crotchet's Gill the next morning. Indeed, his valise was packed, his walking stick stood ready by the hall stand, and Bunter had already seen to the luggage with his usual silent precision. But fate, that indulgent trickster, had a way of interrupting well-made plans with the rustle of fresh paper. It was shortly after breakfast, as Whimsy lingered over a second cup of tea and a crust of toast, that Constable Driggs arrived at the door, holding a sheaf of files under one arm, and wearing an expression that managed to be both apologetic and grim. "Lord Whimsy," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into the hallway, "I wonder if I might trouble you for another hour of your time." Whimsy took one look at the papers and gestured toward the library. "Trouble, my dear fellow, is one of life's finest invitations. Come in. You've clearly brought me something unpleasant and unavoidably illuminating." They settled into the gloom of the library, where the dust motes floated like retired suspicions. "These," said Driggs, spreading the documents on the table, "are from the County Registrar's archive and the parish record vaults. Took some digging. Quite a few gaps, but I've pieced together something peculiar." Whimsy leaned forward, scanning the pages. What emerged was not a single revelation, but a pattern, dates, names, curious omissions that spoke louder than facts. "The name Marion appears thrice," Driggs explained. "First as a domestic staff entry in 1905, then again in a birth registration, illegitimate. No father named 1906. Infant died, supposedly, but there's no corresponding burial entry in the churchyard, not under that name nor the mother's." "And the third," Whimsy prompted, "a death certificate, issued in 1907, for a girl called Maigret Weston, age 17, cause of death, accidental fall from attic stair. But here's the rub. Her physical description, noted by the local doctor, matches Marion, and the Weston family had no known daughter by that name." Whimsy sat back, steepling his fingers. "So Marion was given a new name for burial, or more. Likely for the record books. Her real death perhaps sanitized." Driggs nodded. "That's my feeling. Mrs. Belden's hand in it, likely, or someone else who didn't want questions asked. It was a quiet time. Lady Ufham's husband had just inherited the estate. A scandal then would have scuppered his social ambitions." "Would indeed," murmured Whimsy, "and how terribly convenient for all concerned." He tapped one sheet lightly. "And the infant?" "Vanished from record. No death, no baptism, no adoption filing. My guess? Handed off quietly. Possibly abroad." There's a rumour one of the former gardeners had connections with a missionary hospital in Ireland. Which gardener? Driggs hesitated. Thoday's father. Whimsy smiled without humour. So it all comes back round again. The gardener's son buries his father's secret, and is buried himself by the echo of it. They were silent. For a moment, the room pressing in with the weight of old paper and older sins. "I'll take these copies," Whimsy said at last. "They'll be useful." "Useful to whom?" Driggs asked quietly. "There's no one to charge, no one left to try." "To history," said Whimsy simply, "which always needs new footnotes, and perhaps to Edward, who deserves to know that his story isn't singular, that others were erased too." Driggs nodded slowly. "You'll tell him?" "In time," said Whimsy. "When the shock of one truth doesn't dull the edges of another. He's young, but he has a spine, he'll carry it." Driggs rose, tucking his hat under his arm. "And Miss Clytemnestra, she's already begun the work, facing it, owning it. She'll tell Edward what he needs to know, and they'll decide the rest between them." Driggs paused at the door. "You're not like most of your sort, Lord Whimsy." "No," said Whimsy, smiling faintly. "I like to think I'm a peculiar botanical hybrid, bred in London soil, but I flower in secrets." After the constable left, Whimsy took the documents and walked to the garden one last time. The light was softer today, the weather tempered, as if the house itself had exhaled. He stood beneath the pear tree, his habitual anchor during this peculiar case, and reread Marian's name, written 3 times under 3 guises. She had been erased so carefully, so deliberately, that it took a death and an accident of turpentine to restore her. Bunter found him there, holding the records like a fragile bouquet. "My lord," he said gently, "the car is ready." Whimsy looked up. "You know, Bunter, we've never dug up a ghost before. Not completely, not from this deep." "No, my lord. But I rather think she's walking again now." He folded the papers, tucked them into his coat, and turned toward the house. Edward and Clytemnestra were in the foyer as he entered. They were no longer seated apart but side by side on the bench beneath the portrait of Lord Upham, a severe man with thin lips and a gaze like a bayonet. The pair stood as Whimsy approached. "You're leaving," Edward said. "Yes, your ghosts are now your own." Clytemnestra met his eyes. "Thank you, Lord Whimsy, not just for uncovering the past, but for letting us sit with it." "I find," said Whimsy, "that truth once aired has its own manners. It doesn't always shout, sometimes it just sits beside you until you're ready." He shook Edward's hand, a firm grip, young but certain. Then he turned to Clytemnestra. "Be gentle with each other," he said. "Forgiveness is a slow crop, but it roots deep." She nodded. Whimsy stepped outside into the late morning sun, Bunter at his side, and paused once more to look back at Crotchet's Gill. The garden stretched beyond the hedges, tangled but no longer malignant. Somewhere beneath its soil, secrets still slept, but one at least had bloomed. He tipped his hat to the breeze, stepped into the waiting car, and let the road begin to unspool before him, straight, level, and for the first time in days, free of shadows. The drive away from Crotchet's Gill wound through the sort of country that invited neither haste nor heedlessness, hedgerows thick with late summer growth, clouds clinging to the hills like gossip that refused to clear, and the faint scent of damp earth in the breeze. Whimsy, his elbow resting on the car window's edge, stared outward with a peculiar stillness. It was the stillness of a man who had solved the riddle, but not the echo it left behind. Bunter, at the wheel, did not speak for nearly a mile. Then, with the mildness of someone commenting on the weather, he said, "There was something else in that house, my lord." Whimsy did not move. "Yes. Not a clue. Not a body. A residue." "Quite so, my lord. The sort that clings to the inside of the spine, not the fingertips." Another stretch of silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the hiss of tires over damp gravel. "I don't suppose," Whimsy murmured, "that one can ever quite clean a house like that. You can air the rooms, sweep out the corners, but there are walls that learn to absorb guilt, not just hide it." "No amount of distemper ever reached the rot behind," Bunter said with quiet agreement. Whimsy gave a faint laugh. "We'll be poets before long, Bunter. We've always been at risk, my lord. The village gave way to the outskirts of a market town, and they stopped briefly for petrol. Whimsy took the opportunity to browse the station book rack and emerged with a battered copy of The Anatomy of Melancholy, as if mocking the house they'd just left. By late afternoon, they reached Oxford. Whimsy insisted on stopping at the Bodleian, of all places. It was not the usual detour of a detective fleeing the countryside, but Whimsy had no intention of fleeing. He was following a scent, not of blood but of thought. The manuscript room was half empty. Whimsy gave his credentials, requested the records of the local almshouse from the early 1900s, and settled into a wooden chair with the weary affection of a man returning to a long-neglected friend. It took 2 hours to find what he was looking for, a brief entry. 1912. A woman registered as Monsieur Weston. Domestic accident, the notes read. Injuries consistent with fall, partial amnesia, transferred from private care. She had been moved to a convalescent hospital in Shropshire. No mention of family. No visitors. Whimsy stared at the page as one stares into a pond that reflects something just out of sight. She lived, he said softly. Bunter, who had appeared with tea at precisely the moment doubt began to creep in, set the cup down. My Lord? Marion. Or Margaret, rather. She didn't die. She was relocated, rewritten. Do you believe she's still alive? Unlikely. But perhaps there's a record, a descendant, a nurse who remembers. And you intend to follow it? Whimsy didn't answer immediately. He tapped his fingers against the side of the book, then softly, No mystery is ever truly closed, Bunter, only forgotten. And if one poor girl's life was rewritten because she knew too much, I would like at least one page rewritten back. They returned to London that evening. The flat in Piccadilly was quiet. The dust settled in neat layers that suggested everything had paused in their absence. But Whimsy, who usually dropped back into his club routines with an air of restored equilibrium, did not resume the usual rhythms. Instead, he sat up late that night. The box from the hothouse opened before him again. The photo of Marion, still young, still clinging to that infant, seemed to watch him. What stories had she told, and what had been silenced in her name? He pulled a sheet of writing paper from his desk and began a letter. To a journalist he knew in Birmingham, one with a keen interest in lost identities and a taste for the improbable. It began, I wonder if you might assist me with a puzzle involving a woman who fell out of history. The next day, he sent copies of the archive materials to Edward along with a note. You need not read these now, but one day perhaps you will. They are not yours to carry alone, but you are among the few who might decide how they are remembered. He enclosed a second envelope, addressed in a different hand, Lady Ufham's. She had asked him, quietly and with unexpected humility, to pass it on. Let him choose whether to open it, she'd said. I've chosen silence for so long I can't presume to break it now. Whimsy had nodded, accepting the compromise. In the days that followed, life resumed its peculiar, unconvincing imitation of normality. The newspapers ran a brief column on the inquest into the death of a gardener in Gloucestershire, ruled accidental with a note of third-party provocation. No names were listed, no scandals unfurled, but Whimsy, though he dined and debated, and occasionally even laughed, felt a quiet shifting beneath his usual poise. Something in him had altered. Late one evening, as he stood by the window of his flat, looking out at the vague glitter of London, he said aloud, more to the night than to Bunter, We solve murders, Bunter. But what we really do, what we must always do, is rescue the vanished, the forgotten, the rewritten. Bunter, standing unobtrusively with a glass of port, gave the slightest nod. And when the dead can no longer speak, Whimsy went on, we must decide whether to speak for them, or to listen so hard that their silence is enough. He turned from the window, smiling faintly. Still, I'm glad we found the boy, even if the house will never be clean. The boy, Bunter, said, is planting new roots, and perhaps one day, said Whimsy, raising the port to his lips, he'll grow something better from them. He drank. The fire crackled, and in the quiet that followed, Lord Peter Whimsy allowed himself, for the first time since the gardener fell, to rest. The crisp morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the Piccadilly flat, casting soft, pools of pale gold across the worn oak desk, where Lord Peter Wimsey sat surrounded by a quiet clutter of letters, photographs, and half-read books. The city beyond hummed with the usual muted chaos, the distant clang of a tram, a street hawker's plaintive call. But here, in this pocket of genteel repose, the world had been distilled into a series of hushed secrets and unanswered questions. Wimsey's fingers rested lightly upon the envelope he had just received, its handwriting unmistakably delicate and precise. He recognized the crest embossed on the seal, the Wedge family's mark, humble but resolute. Inside he found a letter, its edges worn, the ink faint but steady. "Dear Lord Wimsey, I write to you with a trembling hand and a cautious heart. My name is Alice Wedge, cousin to the man who sheltered your Edward many years ago. I have held this knowledge close, fearing that the past, once disturbed, might bring more harm than peace. Marian, the woman you sought, is gone now, but not before she spoke often of a child she had raised in secret. She loved him fiercely, and though the world never acknowledged his name, she believed he carried her hope. There is more, of course, secrets that even the house at Crotchet's Gill could not contain. If you are willing, I will tell you what I know, for the sake of those who cannot speak." Wimsey folded the letter carefully and leaned back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. The invitation was both a balm and a summons, the final thread, perhaps, in a tangled tapestry of silence and sorrow. Bunter, who had entered quietly, caught Wimsey's gaze and inclined his head. "Shall I arrange for transport to the Wedge farm, my lord?" "Indeed, Bunter. It appears our garden of mysteries has one last bloom." By afternoon they were journeying through the verdant countryside to a modest farmhouse tucked between rolling fields and whispering woods. Alice Wedge met them at the gate, a woman in her late 50s with eyes sharp as a hawk's and a kindness that softened the harsh lines of time. Inside, the air smelled of fresh bread and lavender, a stark contrast to the shadows that lingered in the corners of Crotchet's Gill. Over tea and homemade scones, Alice began to unravel the final chapters. "Marian was a remarkable woman," she said softly. "She bore burdens no one should carry, but she did it with quiet dignity. When she learned of the child's true lineage, she took him into her home. The boy, Edward, was her light in those dark years." Wimsey listened intently as Alice recounted how Marian had confided in her only once, speaking of the heavy price of silence and the fear that the past might one day return to claim them all. "There was a man," Alice said, voice dropping, "a visitor from the city, curious and insistent. He asked too many questions, and Marian feared for the boy's safety. She moved him again, but the shadow lingered." Wimsey's thoughts drifted to Skeggs, to Mrs. Belden, to the suffocating loyalty that had tried to suffocate truth itself. "Do you know who this visitor was?" Alice shook her head. "No, but his presence was enough to unsettle Marian. She made me promise to protect Edward no matter the cost." The weight of unspoken histories hung between them like a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful, intricate, and perilous. As the afternoon waned, Wimsey and Bunter prepared to leave. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fields. "Thank you, Miss Wedge," Wimsey said, offering his hand. "Your courage in sharing these stories will ensure that those who suffered are not forgotten." Alice smiled faintly. "May it be so, Lord Wimsey." The journey back to London was quiet, contemplative. Wimsey sat by the window, eyes tracing the shifting countryside as the fading light softened the edges of a story long buried. Once home, he settled into his familiar armchair, the glow of a reading lamp illuminating the thoughtful lines on his face. He penned a brief note to Edward. "Your story is no longer alone. The past has unfolded for you, not as a chain but as roots. Choose your own growth." He sealed the letter and placed it carefully on the desk, alongside the photographs and letters that had marked the journey from shadow into light. Wimsey rose, moving to the window to gaze upon the restless cityscape beyond. Somewhere in its depths, a boy named Edward was learning to claim a history that had been denied him. The detective smiled, quietly satisfied. For though mysteries may twist and linger like tangled vines, the truth, once nurtured, can bloom anew. Bright, unyielding and free, The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Crotchet's Gill, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards and dust motes that danced silently in the still air. Lord Peter Wimsey stood alone in the great drawing-room, the evidence laid bare before him on a low table. Letters, photographs, faded documents, and the silver locket whose clasp had, at last, been unlocked not just physically, but emotionally. Outside, the garden stirred with the gentle rustling of leaves and the faint buzz of insects, life, persistent and unyielding. The house seemed quieter than before, its secrets spoken aloud, its ghosts given voice. He was not alone for long. Lady Upham entered first, her composure faltering slightly as her eyes took in the scene. Miss Clytemnestra followed, her expression guarded but resolute. Edward stood just behind her, the weight of his inheritance settling like a mantle that was both burden and birthright. Wimsey gestured to the collection of truths. "This, ladies and gentlemen," he began, "is the harvest of a gardener's final toil. But more than that, it is a testament to the human heart's complexity, where love and fear, loyalty and deception intertwine in ways that defy simple judgment." Lady Upham's voice was quiet. "I have lived with the consequences of my choices for years. I thought silence was protection, but it has only bred pain." Clytemnestra's eyes glistened. "And I have lived in shadow, believing my son lost before he was known. Now I see the truth was simply hidden." Edward stepped forward, holding the silver locket carefully in his hands. "Knowing the past doesn't undo it," he said softly. "But it gives me something to hold on to, a history not of shame, but of survival." Wimsey nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. The gardener's last harvest was not just of earth, but of memory. We have uncovered more than a death. We have unearthed lives intertwined by circumstance and choice, and in doing so, we remind ourselves that every secret has a root, every silence a sound waiting to be heard. He turned to Lady Upham. "Justice in this case is less about punishment and more about acknowledgement. Mrs. Belden has fled, as you know, but the truth you have all shared today will serve as its own reckoning." Lady Upham nodded slowly, a quiet acceptance in her eyes. Wimsey then addressed Edward and Clytemnestra. "You have a future before you, unshackled from the past's darkest shadows. That is no small gift." The room fell into a contemplative silence, filled only by the distant song of a bird and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock, a reminder that time moves on, even when history stands still. Wimsey glanced at Bunter, who stood near the doorway, his expression as calm and steady as ever. "And now," Wimsey said, "I believe it is time for me to take my leave. The garden has been tended, the roots uncovered. What grows from here is yours to nurture." He stepped toward the door, pausing briefly to look back at the trio who remained, their faces a blend of relief, sorrow, and tentative hope. With a final nod, he crossed the threshold, his figure retreating down the long corridor until it disappeared into the bright morning light. Outside, the garden basked in the sun, the pear tree standing tall and proud as ever. Somewhere beneath its branches, buried secrets rested no longer, replaced by the promise of new beginnings. Lord Peter Wimsey walked away with the soft crunch of gravel beneath his feet and the quiet satisfaction that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not of death, but of life reclaimed. And as the gate closed gently behind him, a single violet pressed between the pages of the Anatomy of Melancholy fluttered softly in the breeze, an echo of remembrance, a whisper of grace.